Greetings, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks for joining me for this episode of ATP. Today we're going to tackle 3 questions about the Lord's Supper. Question number 1. Dear Pastor, is intinction a proper practice? It's technically not drinking the wine. My hometown church still has beautiful individual silver cups, and my current church practices intinction. I've never liked either the common cup or intinction for sanitary reasons, although I do realize that intinction is a faster way of communing. I do believe that communion is a very serious matter while practicing this method. What is your opinion? So when he says intinction, what we mean is taking the host, the body of Christ, and dipping it in the chalice. That's what we talk about when we say intinction. So the biblical practice was simply that everyone would drink from one cup, one chalice. This is what would have happened on the night in which Jesus was betrayed. It's also then what St. Paul describes happening in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and 11. So everyone drinks from the one cup because then it's a symbol of the unity that we all have. That's a symbol of our one faith, our one doctrine, and our one Lord. And so when we partake of the Lord's Supper, Paul says it's a fellowship of the body and blood of Christ, meaning we are eating and drinking Christ's true body and his true blood, but it's also a fellowship with those around us. And so it's not just a me and Jesus thing, but rather it's a me and Jesus along with everybody else who's at this altar, all believing the same common Christian faith. And that's what the one cup then symbolizes. Now, the use of the individual cup destroys that symbolism. Individual cups, as far as my research can tell, were first introduced in the 1880s by the Reformed, who reject Christ's real presence in the Lord's Supper. And in many cases, neither do they use wine. And so the practice of individual cups is a very recent innovation in the church. It's a novum, a new thing. And the reason for the individual cups they were originally suggested was, like you mentioned, hygiene. It was believed that the individual cups are more sanitary than everybody drinking from one cup. And several studies have demonstrated that this simply just isn't the case. I would argue that it's actually safer to drink from the chalice for 2 reasons. First, wine does have some antiseptic properties. The alcohol content of wine does deter a lot of pathogens, although not all of them by any means. And the second thing that would hopefully calm any apprehension that you may have about the chalice is the fact that in most churches the sacred vessels are made of precious metals, gold and silver plated. And precious metals have long been known to have antimicrobial properties, which is one of the reasons why they've historically been used for administering the Lord's Supper. Now, frankly, I'll be honest with you, there's no way to celebrate the Lord's Supper in a 100% germ-free way. Just like there's no way to live in this creation in a 100% germ-free way. Nor should we try to live like that, I don't think. But really, individual cups are no less hygienic over the chalice. And so I don't really see any reason to use them. Now, that's not to say that using them goes contrary to Christ's institution, because you are still drinking Christ's blood. Again, I inherited the use of individual cups at Holy Cross, and we have just fewer than a handful of people that use them, and I accommodate that. But that doesn't affect the essence of the sacrament, what it is. The communicants, like we said, are still taking and drinking the Lord's body and blood, or the Lord's blood. I guess you don't drink his body. You understand. And really, that's the problem I see with intinction. It's not faithful to the words, take and drink, because the minister dips the host into the wine before placing it on your tongue. Now, Martin Chemnitz, Lutheran theologian, dealt with this, addressed this in his examination of the Council of Trent. And he says a couple things about intinction. Chemnitz notes that historically, Julius, the Bishop of Rome, right after the time of Nicaea, he rejected intinction in 340 AD because it didn't square with Christ's words of institution. Or what Paul said in 1 Corinthians about drinking from one cup. Now, in the ancient church, the practice originated as an exception for those who were sick and couldn't drink. And it appears, though, that at the time of Julius, there were those who wanted to make the exception into the rule, using the pretext of reverence for the blood of Christ. So they said, since we don't want to spill Christ's precious blood, let's just use intinction. Now, Julius rejected that, and Chemnitz then also then follows suit, follows Julius's example. Chemnitz even mentions several other times throughout the early church history, or rather early medieval history, where intinction was again introduced under the pretext of reverence for the blood of Christ, but in each case was rejected by the church as an inadequate means of receiving the Lord's Supper. So I think just for the sake of certainty, the best way to show reverence for the body and blood of Christ is to simply eat it and drink it in faith, trusting in Christ's words so that you receive his promised benefits. So that's my take on intinction. I'm going to follow Chemnitz on that one. Question number 2. Dear Pastor, the question I have is about the boundaries, such as communion with other churches. Communion at other churches, such as a Lutheran taking communion at a Roman Catholic church. What boundaries must be followed? This question comes to my mind because my girlfriend wants me to take communion with her, but growing up, I've learned from my church and my parents that I must not. I want to be sure without breaking my boundaries. Just to be real frank, it would be inappropriate for you to commune at a papist altar, and here's why. When you commune at that altar, it is a public confession that you agree with the doctrine being taught at that altar. And so that would be a confession that you believe the Roman Catholic doctrine, since you'd be communing at a Roman Catholic altar. And that would also place you in communion with Rome and with all other Roman Catholics. Now, the trend in our day is to treat altars and communion rails more like McDonald's than churches that have actual teachings. And so people want to imagine that they can go to any Mick church and get their Mick communion, and then it's the same everywhere you go. But this attitude individualizes the Lord's Supper and removes it from what I call the horizontal aspect of communion with the doctrine that's taught at that altar. And so communing at a papist altar would then confess that you are in agreement with papist doctrine. Now, as a Lutheran, you're obviously not in communion with papist doctrine. So here's what I would suggest. I would suggest you can go to Mass with your girlfriend. It'd be a great learning experience for you. But beforehand, explain this to her and tell her that you'll be happy to sit in the pew while she communes, while she partakes of the Lord's Supper, and you'll do so reverently. And in fact, I think this would be a good on-ramp for you guys, for a discussion that you need to have at some point about your different beliefs. Quite frankly, if there's a future with this girl, then you need to make sure that you're both unified in the common Christian faith before you enter marriage. And I think this conversation is a good on-ramp into having that conversation. That's, again, if you see a future with this girl and if it's heading in that direction, of course. But no communing at papist altars. Or any other altars other than the Lutheran communion with which you are in communion, the Lutheran fellowship with whom you are in communion. Final question then, communion frequency. Dear Pastor, how often do ELDONA congregations practice Holy Communion? I'm familiar with the 3 major Lutheran denominations in the U.S., ELCA, LCMS, and WELS. Churches in these groups, if they aren't already practicing it, are moving towards weekly communion. They cite portions of the Augsburg Confession to support this practice. Throughout the Scriptures, throughout the New Testament, in Acts, and in Paul's letter, worship is always described as consisting of word and sacrament, preaching and the Lord's Supper. And the Reformers took note of this and the long history of every Sunday communion and confessed that that was the proper Christian practice. Now, there are some Lutherans, even within those Lutheran bodies that you mentioned, that brush off the last couple articles of the Augustana because they deal with papist abuses. And they say that those articles aren't doctrinal but practical, and so we're not bound to their practices. But really, that's an attitude that just doesn't take the confession seriously as confessional documents. The confessions not only confess the true doctrine, but also show how the true doctrine is practiced, which is the reason why those specific abuse articles were included in the Augsburg Confession. So, the pastors of the ELDONA take their ordination vows very seriously, and we seek to conform all of our ministries to the Lutheran Confessions, and that includes what the Lutheran Confessions say in Article 24 of the Augsburg Confession and its apology about the Lord's Supper. The most succinct statement comes in AP 24, right at the very beginning. For among us, Masses are celebrated every Lord's Day and on other festival days in which the sacrament is offered to those who wish to use it after they have been examined and absolved. So because of what the Lord's Supper, or because of what the Holy Scriptures teach about the Lord's Supper and the benefits offered through it, Lutherans typically then should be having the Lord's Supper every Lord's Day and every festival day of the Church, Christmas, Easter, Ascension, for example. Another benefit of that is I see as parish boundaries widen in this age, and not everyone can make it to church on a communion Sunday. It's nice to have communion every Sunday. That way you don't have to try to make it on a certain Sunday if you live farther away. Now, to the best of my knowledge, all the pastors of the diocese practice every Sunday communion, with the exception of one. And that one parish that does not, I know that the pastor is actively working towards implementing every Sunday communion. That's not something that that is within the pastor's authority, of course, to implement, but it's something that needs to be done very carefully so that consciences who aren't familiar with the practice and the reasons for it aren't vexed by it and burdened by it. So yeah, we practice every Sunday communion because that is the true Lutheran practice and the true, then, Catholic practice of the Augsburg Confession. To all three of you, thank you for your questions. We'll catch you next time on ATP Ask the Pastor.